An ordinary Don Cossack and veteran of several wars, Yemelyan Pugachev fled and wandered until he proclaimed himself Emperor Peter III, miraculously saved from death. This audacious impostor swiftly led a rebellion that engulfed vast territories and directly challenged Catherine the Great. His revolt shook the empire to its foundations, becoming the most grandiose popular upheaval in Russian history until the 20th century. However, behind the romanticized image of a people's czar, a defender of the oppressed, lies something far more sinister. This is not a heroic epic about the struggle for justice, but a ruthless chronicle of a grand swindle that plunged the Russian Empire into chaos, costing hundreds of thousands of lives. Pugachev became not just a rebel, but the living embodiment of the very horror of the 18th century, exposing all the deep-seated flaws of absolutism. To truly comprehend the nature of this horror, one must look to its very origin, the life of a simple Cossack who seemed destined for a different fate. Yemelyan Ivanovich Pugachev was born in 1742 in the small stanitsa of Zimoveyskaya on the Don, incidentally, the same place where Stepan Razin was once born. From his earliest childhood, he was surrounded by the harsh, frontier reality of Cossack life, endless military campaigns, the necessity to survive, and the constant struggle to defend their land. This was an environment that unforgivingly hardened character, but also taught one to transgress laws when necessity or ambition demanded it. At 17, Yemelyan married Sofia Nedyuzheva, a local Cossack woman, but family life did not prevent him from being conscripted into the army. His military odyssey, which lasted almost 10 years, then began. He participated in the 7 Years' War, serving in Denis Yefremov's regiment, and in the Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774. It was on the battlefields, amidst blood and hardship, that not only his combat experience but also a profound inner turmoil developed. Constant illnesses, wounds, humiliating drills, and most importantly, the pervasive sense of injustice that plagued him and his fellow soldiers. All of this accumulated like a festering wound. He witnessed officers plundering the treasury and soldiers dying not from enemy bullets but from hunger and disease. These traumas, these unhealing wounds on his soul, became fertile ground for the future rebel. By 1773, after several desertions and captures, Pugachev was no longer the young Cossack who had gone to war. He was a desperate, exhausted man, pursued by the authorities, branded as a fugitive and a criminal. It was then, in deep despondency and hopelessness, that an idea bloomed in his mind like a poisonous flower, forever changing his life and the fate of the empire. The point of no return had been crossed. An ordinary Cossack, cornered by the system, decided not just to survive, but to overturn the world by donning another's crown. He could no longer return to his former life, and from this desperation, his grand adventure was born. But for such a daring plan to not just be conceived in the desperate mind of a runaway Cossack, but also to take root, it needed special ground. The Russian Empire in the mid-18th century was a powder keg of contradictions, ready to explode. Catherine the Great's power, unshakable in the capital, felt like a distant, unjust hand across the vast expanses of the country. The era of palace coups had sown deep distrust of the throne. Emperors succeeded each other rapidly, and each new ruler, coming to power on the bayonets of the guard, reinforced in the popular consciousness the idea of a shaky throne. The mysterious death of Peter III, considered unjustly overthrown, sparked a wave of rumors and legends about his miraculous salvation, an ideal breeding ground for an impostor. The economic situation for the majority of the population was catastrophic. Serfdom had reached its zenith, turning millions of people into rightless property, bought, sold, and gambled away. Landowners, granted unlimited power, squeezed the last drops from the peasants, increasing corvée and quitrent. State taxes, monopolies on salt and alcohol, and forced conscription into the army, all these placed an unbearable burden on the people. In the Urals, where metallurgy was developing, the situation of factory peasants and assigned laborers was little better. Brutal exploitation, hard labor, and for the slightest disobedience, flogging and exile. These pockets of tension smoldered across the country, ready to ignite. Social stratification had reached a critical point. A bottomless chasm yawned between the privileged elite and the multi-million-strong mass of serfs. The Cossacks, once a bulwark of liberties, were gradually deprived of their autonomies, becoming appendages of the regular army. The government unified their way of life, taxed them, and placed them under strict control, provoking simmering discontent. Old believers, persecuted for their faith, saw the state as the embodiment of the Antichrist, and in rebellions, the coming of a true Tsar liberator. The peoples of the Volga and Urals also seethed with discontent. Their lands were being taken away, taxes were rising, and traditions were suppressed. In this atmosphere of widespread discontent and despair, where rumors and superstitions replaced accurate information, and the belief in a good Tsar savior remained the last hope, any, even absurd, promise of freedom found an instant response. Society, fractured and exhausted, was ready to follow anyone who dared to challenge the established order. It was these circumstances, and not solely personal charisma or desperation, that created the ideal platform for the most massive and bloody swindle of the 18th century. It was on this fertile ground, in August 1773, on the banks of the Yaik River, that the ordinary Don Cossack, Yemelyan Pugachev, began his grand deception, staging the first act of a colossal mystification. He didn't simply appear before the crowd and declare himself emperor. It was a meticulously directed performance, thought out to the smallest detail. Before revealing himself to the world, Pugachev spent months interacting with Yaik Cossacks, old believers, and runaway peasants, seeking out the most discontented and desperate. He took his time, initially only hinting at his czarist origin, cautiously testing the waters, observing how rumors of a miraculously saved sovereign took root. When the ground was prepared, the hour of revelation arrived. In late August, gathering a small group of like-minded individuals around him, Pugachev appeared before a Cossack circle. Exhausted but with a frantic gleam in his eyes, he loudly declared himself the miraculously saved Emperor Peter III. He recounted his escape from captivity, his wanderings across the vast expanses of Russia, and the conspiracy of evil boyars who had deprived him of the throne. This was the story millions yearned to hear, the tale of an unjustly overthrown yet miraculously survived Tsar who had returned to save his people from oppression. Pugachev skillfully played on the deeply ingrained popular belief in a good Tsar savior, the only one capable of restoring justice. But a mere proclamation was not enough. For the deception to become truly massive, it needed to be bolstered by concrete actions. And Pugachev launched a colossal recruitment campaign based on unheard-of promises. Across the country like a wildfire, his manifestos spread, forged decrees written by his few but literate associates. These fake documents, sealed with a homemade imperial seal, declared complete freedom from serfdom, liberation from all taxes and conscription, and the transfer of lands, forests, and estates into the full ownership of peasants and Cossacks. He promised salt without duty and the right to duty-free fishing and hunting. These were not mere words. They were a direct indulgence for destroying the existing order, a promise of a total reshaping of the world to benefit those who had suffered for decades from unbearable oppression. To maintain the illusion and legitimize his Tsarist status, Pugachev created a primitive but effective imperial court. He appointed generals, counts, and princes from among his closest associates, yesterday's runaway Cossacks and peasants who suddenly acquired unprecedented ranks and power. He received petitions, administered justice, issued decrees, and most importantly, demonstratively punished enemies of the throne, landowners, officials, and officers who fell into his hands. These massacres, committed in the name of the emperor, were not merely acts of violence but rituals designed to demonstrate Tsarist will and assert his absolute power over life and death. Thus, step by step, on the foundation of despair and age-old injustice, this monstrous mystification was built, one that would very soon plunge the entire empire into bloody chaos. This monstrous mystification required not only fertile ground but also an extraordinary master of deception. Yemelyan Pugachev proved to be such a master, demonstrating an astonishing talent for manipulation, like a natural psychologist capable of reading the collective subconscious. His charisma was not the brilliance of an enlightened mind or noble origin. It was the charisma of despair, amplified by an animalistic instinct. He skillfully played the role of the good Tsar, a suffering figure returned from oblivion. But behind this mask lurked a ruthless pragmatist. He received petitions, listened to complaints, and displayed ostentatious mercy to loyal subjects. Yet he did not hesitate to order the execution of anyone who expressed the slightest doubt or disobedience. This blend of promises and cruelty created powerful psychological pressure, making people believe and fear simultaneously. Pugachev didn't just promise freedom. He delivered it here and now, allowing his supporters to immediately exact revenge on their oppressors, plunder landowners' estates, and seize lands. This was a direct appeal to the lowest instincts: greed, envy, and the thirst for vengeance. He legitimized chaos, transforming it into czarist will. His decrees were not abstract declarations. They were concrete instructions for action that were immediately put into practice. He promised not only the abolition of taxes, but also the right to land, waters, forests, and estates, as well as freedom of faith, everything that had been taken from the people. These promises, reinforced by the possibility of immediate retribution against enemies, created a chain reaction. Everyone who joined received immediate benefits, which stimulated others to follow him. To enhance the effect and spread his influence, Pugachev surrounded himself with experts, people who could lend his imposture an appearance of legitimacy and organization. His closest associates, such as Ivan Zarubin, nicknamed Chika, Afanasy Sokolov, Klopusha, or Ivan Beloborodov, were not merely thugs. They were leaders with a certain authority among Cossacks, peasants, or factory workers. They knew the local terrain, had connections, and some, like Chika, possessed literacy, which was invaluable for composing manifestos. These generals and colonels became conduits of his will, creating an aura of a czarist court around him and spreading rumors of his miraculous salvation. They helped generate excitement by distributing tsarist charters and holding public receptions where the emperor revealed himself to the people. Beyond this, Pugachev possessed a unique ability to adapt. He was not a rigid fanatic. He was a flexible manipulator who changed his tactics and rhetoric depending on the audience. To the Cossacks, he was a defender of ancient liberties. To the peasants, a liberator from serfdom. To the old believers, a true anointed one who would restore their right to the old faith. He absorbed popular aspirations and myths, immediately turning them into part of his legend. He learned on the fly, observing the crowd's reaction, perfecting his game, and transforming every new circumstance into an opportunity to strengthen his power. It was this astonishing mixture of cruelty, charisma, and tactical flexibility that made him not just a rebel, but the central figure of a grand swindle that plunged the empire into bloody turmoil. While Pugachev ignited the flames of rebellion, behind the scenes of this bloody drama acted players whose interests surprisingly coincided with his insane plan. History does not record direct high-ranking patrons who wished to place an impostor on the throne, but shadows behind the throne were real. On the contrary, numerous court factions, constantly intriguing against each other, and the lingering shadow of the murdered Peter III, whose mysterious demise continued to stir minds and undermine the legitimacy of the new government, created ideal ground for the emergence of any impostor capable of exploiting popular aspirations for their own ends. It was this atmosphere of palace coups, instability, and opacity of power that fed the ground for the coming chaos. The primary beneficiaries of this insane undertaking, however, were millions of the dispossessed. Peasants, Cossacks, factory workers, all who had suffered for decades from unbearable oppression, suddenly received not just hope, but a real opportunity to acquire land, freedom, and settle scores with their oppressors. Pugachev gave them not abstract promises, but concrete instructions for immediate action: burn, plunder, kill, and all in the name of the Tsar Liberator. This indulgence for chaos, this legitimization of violence, became the most powerful catalyst, causing the rebellion to grow with unprecedented speed. At the other pole of this conflict stood Catherine the Great, an empress whose enlightened reign, seemingly unshakable, suddenly faced a challenge of unprecedented scale. She, who had come to power through a palace coup and deposed her husband Peter III, now confronted his resurrection in the person of a low-born Cossack. This was not merely a revolt but a direct challenge to her legitimacy, a blow to the very foundation of her power. Catherine, initially underestimating the threat, perceived Pugachev as an ordinary fugitive criminal. She sent small punitive detachments against him, confident of their quick victory. However, each new report brought increasingly alarming news, and it soon became clear. She faced not a minor rebel, but the leader of a grand popular war capable of plunging the empire into an abyss. Realizing the true scale of the threat, Catherine the Great mobilized the full might of the empire. In early 1774, not just a punitive detachment but entire corps of regular troops under the command of experienced generals, Ivan Mikhelson, Pyotr Golitsyn, Alexander Suvorov, were dispatched against Pugachev and his growing army. This was no longer a hunt for a runaway Cossack, but a full-scale war, and its course was predetermined, despite the rebels' impressive, though short-lived, successes. Initially, the impostor's army continued to win local victories, capture fortresses, and sow panic. Orenburg, Ufa, Kazan, these names became symbols of fierce resistance and brutal massacres. But Pugachev, despite all his charisma and ability to manipulate the crowd, was not a strategist. His army, a motley crowd of peasants, Cossacks, and factory workers, was poorly disciplined, poorly armed, and incapable of confronting a trained regular army in open battle. Pugachev's tactics relied on sudden raids, sieges, and numerical superiority, but they faltered when encountering professional soldiers. The turning point was the defeat near Kazan in July 1774. After capturing and plundering the city, Pugachev's forces encountered Mikhelson's troops. In a fierce battle that lasted several hours, the rebels' disorderly ranks were routed, and the impostor himself miraculously escaped capture, fleeing with the remnants of his supporters across the Volga. This was not just a loss. It was the first serious blow to the myth of his invincibility, to the belief in tsarist luck. From this moment, his steady decline began. After the Kazan catastrophe, Pugachev tried to revive the uprising, moving south, promising freedom and land to millions of serfs in central Russia. In August 1774, his detachments besieged Tsaritsyn, but they were also defeated there. Government troops systematically cut off escape routes, destroyed strongholds, and most importantly, deprived him of support. The cruelty of the massacres that followed each of Pugachev's victories began to alienate even those who had initially been ready to join. People saw not a good czar, but a ruthless executioner who brought not freedom, but only death and destruction. The internal crisis in Pugachev's camp grew. His closest associates, those very generals and counts who had recently been ready to follow him to the end, now saw the approaching retribution. They understood that the game was over, and that their only chance to save themselves was to betray their leader. It was at this moment of despair, as his army dwindled and his pursuers closed in, that Pugachev made his last and fatal mistake. He trusted those closest to him too much. On the night of September 12, 1774, on the bank of the Uzan River in the Trans-Volga steppes, the inevitable happened. A group of his own, once loyal Cossack atamans, Fyodor Chumakov, Ivan Tvorogov, Kharlampy Perfilyev, seized their emperor. They bound him, put him on a horse, and escorted him to government troops. This was not a heroic capture in battle, but a cynical betrayal, proving that behind the mask of the people's czar was merely an ordinary man, cornered. Thus ended the grandest spectacle of deception. The last act of his personal tragedy began, and the empire finally breathed a sigh of relief. The capture of the impostor did not mean an immediate return to tranquility. The empire certainly breathed a sigh of relief, but the consequences of Pugachev's revolt, this colossal upheaval, were only just beginning to manifest, as after an earthquake. The country's economy suffered enormous damage. Entire regions, especially the Volga region and the Urals, lay in ruins. The factory industry, centered precisely in the Urals, was paralyzed. Many factories which produced pig iron and iron vital to the state were burned, plundered, or ceased operations for months, even years. Ore reserves remained untouched in the ground, but the infrastructure for their extraction and processing was destroyed. Investors, both domestic and foreign, frantically withdrew capital from dangerous regions, fearing new unrest and loss of their investments. Restoration required not only huge financial injections, but also a complete overhaul of the management system. The Crown, in the person of Catherine the Great, acted decisively. Realizing that the cause of such a large-scale uprising was not only Pugachev's personality but also systemic problems, the Empress initiated large-scale political and administrative changes. Already in 1775, the gubernia reform was carried out, radically changing the administrative territorial division of the empire. The number of gubernias almost doubled, from 23 to 50, each of which was divided into uyezds. This allowed for a significant strengthening of the vertical of power, brought administration closer to the population, and ensured stricter control over territories, which had been impossible previously due to vast distances and weak connection to the center. New governors appeared locally, endowed with broad powers, as well as new judicial and fiscal bodies, designed to prevent a recurrence of chaos. Simultaneously, the government finally dealt with the remnants of Cossack autonomies, which had become hotbeds of unrest. The Yaik Cossack host, from which Pugachev originated, was renamed the Ural Cossack host and fully subordinated to central authority. The Zaporozhian Sich, another symbol of free spirit, was liquidated in the same year, 1775. Its lands passed under direct state control, and the Cossacks were either enlisted in regular regiments or turned into state peasants. The government sought to suppress any attempts to revive Cossack liberties, which were now perceived as a direct threat to statehood. The financial consequences of the war were colossal. Suppressing the uprising required enormous funds, which were diverted from other budget items, including the military needs of the Russo-Turkish War. The treasury was depleted, forcing the government to seek new sources of revenue and tighten tax policy, which in turn fell even more heavily on the shoulders of the common people. However, despite this, Catherine did not abandon her enlightened ideas, though she proceeded with greater caution, understanding how fragile the social peace in the empire was. The fear of a new revolt, of the horror of the 18th century, as it came to be called, became deeply rooted in the consciousness of the ruling elite, prompting them to further tighten the screws of serfdom and suppress any manifestations of discontent. But even after the smoke of battles cleared and the guilty were punished, the ghost of Pugachev did not disappear. On the contrary, he began his second, far longer and more peculiar life in popular memory. The truth about the ruthless adventurer who cynically exploited the despair of millions gradually dissolved into legends. In its place came the image of a sufferer, a fighter for justice, almost a saint, returned from oblivion to save the people from their chains. Thus, a grand swindle that cost hundreds of thousands of lives transformed into a heroic epic, where the impostor became the people's tsar, and his bloody rebellion, a great struggle for freedom. It is in this that the main paradox of his legacy lies. For some, he forever remained the embodiment of horror, anarchy, and bloody turmoil. For others, a symbol of the unbending will of the people, their eternal dream of freedom and justice. He did not bring liberation in the form it was expected, but his name became a banner for future generations, a reminder that all patience has its limits, and any suppression generates a response. Pugachev, unknowingly, became an archetype, the eternal return of that force that slumbers in the depths of popular despair. He showed how fragile order built on injustice can be, and how easily despair turns into blind rage. The story of Yemelyan Pugachev is not merely a chronicle of one rebellion, but a profound study of the nature of power and the people. It teaches us that when the chasm between the ruling elite and the masses becomes bottomless, when injustice reaches its climax and the voice of despair is silenced, then even the most absurd myth can ignite millions. It is an eternal warning that true stability is based not on fear and suppression, but on trust and justice. His revolt, this horror of the 18th century, forever left a scar on the body of the empire, serving as a grim but instructive lesson on the price of ignoring popular aspirations. He remains an echo of an era when millions of people yearned for change and were ready to believe anyone who dared to challenge the established order, even if that challenge came from a low-born Cossack who wore another's crown.